The pawnshop bell gave a tired little chime as the woman stepped inside, holding a velvet ring box with both hands as though it contained a heartbeat instead of a piece of jewelry. Outside, late autumn rain blurred the windows. Cars rolled past without slowing. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, metal polish, and forgotten stories. The owner looked up from his counter. "I'll be right with you." She nodded but said nothing. Her fingers rested on the tiny box. She opened it just enough to catch a glimpse of the simple gold wedding band inside. The engraving had almost faded after 26 years. Forever, no matter what. She closed the lid before the memory could pull her under. Across town, in a children's hospital, a 7-year-old boy named Noah was running out of time. The woman had never met him. She didn't know his last name. She didn't know where his family came from. All she knew was that a desperate mother had stood outside the hospital cafeteria that morning, trying to smile for her son, while quietly telling someone on the phone they had exhausted every option. That sentence had stayed with her. "We've sold everything we own." Margaret Ellis was 54 years old. Every weekday before sunrise, she tied on a faded blue apron and opened the doors of Willow Street Bakery, where she'd worked for nearly 18 years. She wasn't the owner. She wasn't the manager. She simply baked bread, arranged pastries, and remembered the favorite orders of customers who often forgot her name. People described her as dependable, kind, quiet. She lived alone in a modest apartment above an old hardware store. The building creaked whenever the wind changed direction. Most evenings were wonderfully ordinary. She watered the small plants on her windowsill. She called her elderly father at the assisted living center. She read 2 chapters of a library novel before bed. The only photograph displayed in her living room showed a younger Margaret laughing beside her husband Daniel, on their wedding day. Daniel had passed away 8 years earlier after a long illness. The wedding ring resting inside that velvet box had become the last object she simply couldn't imagine letting go. Not because it was expensive, because it was the final promise she still carried. That Tuesday had begun like every other. Margaret unlocked the bakery before dawn. Fresh dough rested beneath white cloths. Coffee filled the room with warmth before the first customer arrived. Around 7:30, she boxed cinnamon rolls for a construction crew, handed warm muffins to a schoolteacher, and slipped an extra cookie into the bag of an elderly widower who always claimed he wasn't hungry. He always smiled when he found it. "You spoil me," he said. "You remind me of my father," Margaret answered. He tipped his cap and walked away. Moments later, the morning rhythm changed. A little boy wandered toward the pastry display wearing hospital pajamas beneath an oversized coat. His head was covered by a knit cap decorated with tiny rockets. He stared at a chocolate cupcake for several quiet seconds. His mother caught up with him almost immediately. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We were just looking." Margaret smiled. "Looking is free," the boy grinned. "My doctor says I can have chocolate after my treatment. Then today's the perfect day." She placed the cupcake into a small white box. "Oh, we can't, it's already paid for." The woman looked confused. "What do you mean?" Margaret simply smiled. Someone wanted him to have a good morning. The mother's eyes filled before she could stop them. She thanked Margaret 3 different times. As they reached the door, Margaret overheard the beginning of a phone call. I know, the woman whispered. "But after the surgery deposit, we don't have enough left." She stopped speaking. Then came the sentence Margaret would replay all day. "We've sold everything we own." The bakery remained busy, but Margaret found herself glancing toward the hospital visible from the end of the street. She tried focusing on work. She kneaded bread. She washed trays. She greeted customers, yet the image of the exhausted mother lingered like a song she couldn't stop hearing. During her lunch break, she carried a homemade vegetable soup across the street to the hospital cafeteria. She often donated leftover bread to hospital staff. Nobody thought twice about seeing her there. As she entered, she spotted the same little boy sitting beside a window. His cupcake remained untouched. He looked pale. His mother sat beside him pretending to read a magazine, though she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Margaret hesitated. Then she walked over. "I brought too much soup," she said softly. "Would you help me solve that problem?" The boy's face brightened. His mother looked embarrassed. "You've already done enough. I don't think kindness keeps score." For the first time all day the woman laughed. It was brief, fragile, but real. Her name was Elena. She and Noah had driven nearly 6 hours after specialists in another city agreed to attempt an operation many local hospitals couldn't perform. Insurance covered part of the treatment. Not all of it. Friends had organized fundraisers, neighbors had donated, family members had borrowed money. Still, every new complication seemed to come with another impossible bill. "We'll figure it out," Elena said, though the words sounded more like a promise she desperately wanted to believe than one she actually did. Margaret listened far more than she spoke. When Noah excused himself to show a nurse his drawing, Elena lowered her voice. "I keep smiling because he watches my face." She looked toward the hallway. "If I cry, he'll think he's dying." Margaret didn't know what to say. Sometimes silence carried more comfort than advice. She reached across the table and gently squeezed Elena's hand. For a moment, two strangers sat together as if they had known each other for years. That evening, Margaret climbed the stairs to her apartment, carrying an ache she couldn't explain. Rain tapped softly against the windows. She made tea. She opened the old wooden cabinet where she kept Daniel's belongings, his watch, a handwritten anniversary card, their wedding album. Finally, the velvet ring box. She lifted the band into her palm. The gold caught the warm kitchen light. She remembered Daniel slipping it onto her finger inside a tiny country church. Neither of them had much money. The reception had been held in his parents' backyard. Someone's little niece had accidentally knocked over the wedding cake. Everyone laughed. Daniel laughed the hardest. He had whispered, "Perfect days aren't perfect because everything goes right." She could still hear his voice. "They're perfect because we choose each other anyway." A tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. She closed her hand around the ring. What was a promise really worth? Was it something you kept locked inside a drawer, or something you carried into the lives of other people? She sat awake long after midnight, turning those questions over in her mind. By sunrise, she had made a decision that would change far more than one family's future. The next morning, Margaret didn't drive straight to the bakery. Instead, she parked a block away from the pawn shop. The streets were still quiet. A delivery truck rumbled past, its headlights cutting through the lingering mist. She sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes, the velvet box resting on the passenger seat. She picked it up once, set it down, picked it up again. Her wedding ring wasn't just a piece of gold. It carried every anniversary, every late-night conversation, every difficult year she and Daniel had survived together. Selling it felt like saying goodbye all over again. Then she remembered Noah's smile when he'd looked at that untouched cupcake. She took a slow breath, stepped out of the car, and walked inside. The owner recognized her immediately. "You've been thinking about it all night, haven't you?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I suppose it shows." He opened the ring box with careful hands. "It's beautiful. It belonged to my husband." He looked at her for a long moment before naming a price. It wasn't much. Not compared to what the ring meant. Margaret accepted without bargaining. As the paperwork slid across the counter, she signed her name with slightly trembling fingers. The owner counted the cash, then quietly added an envelope from beneath the register. "What's this?" "A little extra. I can't take charity. It's not charity," he smiled. "My wife passed away 5 years ago." He gently closed the velvet box. "If she were here, she'd tell me I'd regret letting you walk out with only what the ring is worth." Margaret's eyes filled. She accepted the envelope with a grateful nod. As she reached the door, the owner called after her. "I hope whatever you're doing brings someone hope." "It already has," she whispered. She never intended anyone to know where the money had come from. At the hospital billing office, she asked if she could make an anonymous payment toward a child's account. The receptionist looked surprised. "We don't usually. I don't need recognition." The woman behind the desk paused. Then she quietly processed the payment. Margaret left before anyone could ask another question. She felt lighter. Not because she'd lost something. Because she'd finally understood why she'd been holding on to it. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, or at least she tried to convince herself it had. She measured flour, folded pastry boxes, refilled coffee. Yet every afternoon she found herself wondering how Noah was doing. 3 days later she carried another basket of fresh bread across the street. The pediatric floor felt different, quieter. The waiting room held families with tired faces and hopeful eyes. She didn't see Noah. She didn't see Elena. Instead a nurse approached her. "You've been bringing food, haven't you?" Margaret nodded. The nurse smiled warmly. "They ask about the bakery lady." "They do?" They said someone reminded them that good people still exist. Margaret laughed softly. I only brought soup. The nurse shook her head. No, you brought something much bigger. Later that afternoon, Margaret overheard two hospital employees talking outside the elevator, still trying to cover the remaining balance. I heard that the surgery might be delayed. Her heart sank. She had believed her contribution would solve the problem. Instead, it had barely made a dent. For the first time since selling the ring, doubt crept into her thoughts. Had she given away the one thing she could never replace, and still failed to help? She walked home under gray skies, carrying that question like an invisible weight. The following Sunday, after church, Margaret visited her father. Walter Ellis had recently turned 82. Age had slowed his body but not his mind. He noticed something was different before she even sat down. You've got your mother's eyes today, she smiled. What does that mean? It means you're carrying something heavy. They walked slowly through the garden behind the assisted living center. Autumn leaves covered the pathways in shades of amber and crimson. Finally, Margaret told him everything. The cupcake, the hospital, the surgery, the ring. She expected him to worry. Instead, he looked toward the trees and smiled. When your mother and I married, we owned exactly $43. She laughed. You remember the amount? I remember every penny. He stopped walking. When you were 9 years old, your mother sold her piano. Margaret frowned. I thought it broke. No. There was a family down the road whose house burned down. He looked directly at her. She never wanted you children to know. Margaret felt something catch in her throat. She loved that piano. She did. Weren't you upset? Walter shook his head. I fell in love with a woman who believed people mattered more than possessions. He gently squeezed her shoulder. I'd have been disappointed if my daughter believed anything different. For the first time in days, Margaret's doubts began to fade. Meanwhile, another story was unfolding beyond her knowledge. Noah's condition had become more complicated. The surgery couldn't wait much longer. Doctors had found an additional problem that required specialized equipment, more expenses, more paperwork, more impossible decisions. Elena sat alone in a consultation room, staring at forms she couldn't afford to sign. She kept thinking about the anonymous payment. Someone out there had cared enough to help. She didn't know who. But she silently promised herself that if Noah survived, she would spend the rest of her life becoming that kind of person for someone else. Across town, Margaret's life took an unexpected turn. Mr. Donnelly, the bakery owner, called her into his office. I've got some bad news. Her stomach tightened. We're struggling. He rubbed his forehead. Supply costs keep climbing. Our lease is being increased. He looked genuinely pained. I may have to reduce everyone's hours. Margaret forced a smile. We'll manage. But as she walked back to the kitchen, the reality settled in. She had already emptied most of her small savings years earlier during Daniel's illness. Selling the ring had left almost nothing. Now her income might shrink as well. For a brief moment, fear whispered that perhaps she'd been reckless. She closed her eyes, then she remembered Daniel's words. Perfect days aren't perfect because everything goes right. She returned to kneading bread, steady, patient, without complaint. That Friday evening, as she locked the bakery doors, she noticed a little folded note tucked beneath the handle. There was no name, just careful handwriting. Thank you for reminding my son that kindness still exists. Inside was a child's drawing, a woman holding an umbrella over a little boy while rain fell all around them. Above the picture, written in uneven letters, were 5 simple words. Heroes don't always wear capes. Margaret smiled through tears. She didn't know whether Noah had drawn it. She didn't need to. She folded the picture carefully and slipped it into her purse. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt as though life had quietly handed her a new purpose. She had no idea that her small, anonymous sacrifice had already begun a chain of events that would soon reach far beyond one hospital room, and eventually return to her in a way she could never have imagined. Winter arrived early that year. The trees outside Willow Street Bakery stood bare against pale gray skies, and Christmas lights began appearing in windows across the neighborhood. Margaret loved that time of year, but this season felt different. Every morning, before unlocking the bakery, she unfolded the child's drawing from her purse. Heroes don't always wear capes. She smiled every time she read it. She still had no idea whether Noah's surgery had happened. She prayed for him anyway. One snowy afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after selling her wedding ring, Margaret carried a tray of fresh rolls toward the hospital's volunteer desk. The familiar nurse hurried toward her with an unusually bright smile. "Margaret," she stopped. "I've been hoping I'd see you." Margaret searched the nurse's face. Is the little boy all right?" The nurse nodded. "The surgery was successful." Margaret closed her eyes. One hand covered her mouth as relief washed over her. "Oh, thank God. He still has a long recovery ahead," the nurse continued, "but he's expected to make a full recovery." Margaret didn't realize she was crying until the nurse handed her a tissue. "They wanted to thank you." She looked confused. "I don't think they know who I am." The nurse smiled. "They do now." Margaret followed her down the hallway. As they reached Noah's room, she hesitated at the doorway. Inside, Noah sat upright in bed, coloring a picture. The knit cap was gone, soft brown hair had begun growing back. He looked stronger. Elena looked up first. For a second she simply stared, then tears filled her eyes. "You," Margaret shook her head gently, "you don't have to say anything." But Elena was already crossing the room. She wrapped Margaret in a hug so full of gratitude that neither woman could speak. Noah looked up. "Mom," Elena smiled through tears. "This is the lady I told you about." "The bakery lady?" Margaret laughed softly. "I guess that's me." Noah reached into the drawer beside his bed. "I made something." He handed her another drawing. This one showed two hands holding a small golden ring. Above them was a bright sun. At the bottom in careful handwriting were the words, "Love never disappears. It just helps someone else." Margaret's tears fell freely. Daniel would have loved that sentence. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Hospital staff began sharing the anonymous story with one another. Not names, not amounts, just the story of a woman who had quietly sacrificed something precious for a family she'd never met. Someone mentioned it to a local reporter who specialized in community stories. The reporter refused to publish anything until she found Margaret and asked permission. Margaret almost said no. "I didn't do it for attention." "I know," the reporter replied. "But sometimes people need to be reminded that kindness still exists." After thinking about it overnight, Margaret agreed on one condition. "Please don't make me the hero." The reporter smiled. "Then who is?" Margaret looked toward the hospital. "A mother who never gave up on her son." The story appeared in the Sunday paper. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. A bakery worker, a wedding ring, a stranger's child. Thousands of readers paused over their morning coffee. Many wiped away tears before reaching the final paragraph. The article ended with one sentence. "Compassion often begins with someone who believes another person's child is worth loving too." Something remarkable followed. Letters arrived at the bakery. Christmas cards came from people Margaret had never met. Children mailed hand-drawn pictures. An elderly widower enclosed $20 with a note that read, "Someone helped my family years ago. Thank you for reminding me it's my turn now." A retired teacher knitted blankets for the children's ward. A local grocery store donated meals to families staying at the hospital. A florist began delivering flowers every Friday. Kindness spread quietly, from one person to another, like candles lighting other candles without losing their own flame. One afternoon Mr. Donnelly called Margaret into his office again. This time he was smiling. "I've got good news." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." He held up a stack of catering requests. "Ever since that newspaper story, people have been driving across town to buy from the bakery." Margaret looked surprised. "They're not coming because of the bread. They're coming because they want to support people who remind them what community looks like." He leaned back in his chair. "I can keep everyone employed." Then he added with a grin, "And if you'll accept it." He slid another paper across the desk. It was a promotion, assistant manager, along with a raise. Margaret blinked several times before finding her voice. "I've never asked for anything." "I know," Mr. Donnelly smiled. "That's one of the reasons you've earned it." A few months later, Noah walked into the bakery under his own strength. His scar had faded, his smile hadn't. He carried a small gift bag. "I have something for you." Margaret knelt beside him. "You didn't have to, I wanted to." Inside the bag was a tiny wooden frame. Behind the glass sat the first drawing he'd ever given her. The one of the woman holding an umbrella over a little boy. Below it, someone had engraved a brass plate. "Because one act of kindness can shelter a lifetime of hope." Margaret looked at Elena. "You kept this?" "We made copies." Elena smiled. "We wanted you to have the original." Noah slipped his small hand into hers. "My mom says heroes make people feel safe." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "I think your mom's the brave one." "No," Noah answered with the simple honesty only children possess. "You helped before you even knew us." For a moment no one spoke. The bakery hummed softly around them. Fresh bread cooled on the racks. Customers chatted near the front counter. Life moved on, just as it always does. Yet somehow, everything felt different. That evening, after closing, Margaret visited Daniel's grave for the first time in several months. The air was crisp. She brushed a few fallen leaves from the headstone. "I thought selling the ring meant leaving you behind," she whispered. She smiled toward the fading sunset. "I was wrong." She rested her hand against the cold stone. "You were with me the whole time." A gentle breeze stirred the nearby trees. She didn't need an answer. Some truths are quiet. She realized the ring had never been the real symbol of their marriage. The love they had built together couldn't be locked inside a jewelry box. It lived in every choice inspired by that love, including the hardest one she'd ever made. Years later, a small plaque appeared in the children's wing of the hospital. It didn't mention money. It didn't list donations. It didn't celebrate a famous person. It simply read, "In honor of ordinary people whose quiet kindness gives strangers the courage to keep hoping." Visitors passed it every day. Most never knew the story behind it, but some stopped. Some smiled, some reached for the hand beside them, and every now and then, someone who had almost given up decided to help another family instead. Not because they expected recognition. Not because they wanted praise. But because one ordinary mother had once looked at the last precious thing she owned, and decided that love was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be shared. And long after the wedding ring was gone, its true value continued to shine, not in gold, but in every life it quietly touched.